Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, we're going to be thinking about the question, just how good are we? Are we completely miserable wretches? Are we very innocent and pure, good intentions and so forth? Or are we just kind of a mixed bag? How should we think about these things? Oftentimes in Christian circles, the immediate response is to jump straight to Scripture and think about what the Bible says about our characters. And that's one option you can do. However, tonight we want to focus on what psychological research shows about our characters. And my guest is Dr. Christian Miller, and he asked that I call him Christian. So, hey there, Christian.
Hey, good to see you. Thank you for having me on your show.
It's an honor to have you. You've published this book a few years ago now called The Character Gap with Oxford University Press. And I read it back in December and really enjoyed it, so I wanted to get you on and discuss it with you. So before we begin unpacking some of the main points of the book, what got you interested in studying character and, I guess, the formation of our characters?
Sure, it's a great question. I think there was one kind of pivot point in my career where this happened. So I went to Notre Dame for graduate school. I got my PhD in philosophy. But at that time, I was not working primarily on character. I was working on issues about morality, objective morality, whether morality is a matter of opinion or whether it has a more objective foundation out there apart from human beings. I continued to work on that after I was hired at Wake Forest University, where I am now, for a number of years. But then I kind of got burned out, to tell you the truth. I kind of said what I wanted to say. I didn't really have much more to contribute to the debate, I didn't think. And I was looking for something else to work on. So the topic of character loomed large in my mind because at the time there was a very active debate in philosophy about whether character even exists and whether the psychological research should give us good reason to be skeptical about the existence of character. And so that kind of caught my attention. Wow, this is really important, novel, fresh approach, interdisciplinary, exciting. And so I kind of got myself immersed in that literature, read a bunch of psychology and philosophy, and then it was kind of no looking back for the last, how has it been now? 12, 13 years. It's all about character.
Yeah. All right. Well, you begin this book by first saying what character is. So why don't you explain that to us? What do we mean when we talk about character?
Or at least what I'm going to mean. We can mean all kinds of different things. Like we could mean characters in novels. We can mean characters in plays and drama productions. But I'm talking about something different. I'm talking about specifically moral character. Character can get in different kinds. You can have epistemic or theoretical character. You could have character when it comes to sports or aesthetic character. I'm focused specifically on the moral character traits, which I'm thinking of as those aspects of our mind which are concerned with how we think, feel, and act with respect to moral matters. So a moral character trait is a disposition to think a certain way, be motivated a certain way, and then subsequently act a certain way. Now, that's pretty abstract, so let me try and illustrate it in a couple different ways. Maybe it's helpful at this point to think about character traits as primarily coming in two kinds. There's virtues on the one hand, the good ones, intrinsically good character traits, and then vices on the other hand, the intrinsically bad ones. So let's take an example of a virtue, say compassion. A compassionate person, that's part of their character, a good part of their character, and they are disposed to think a certain way. They think it's important to help others. They think it's bad to neglect others when they're in need. They're motivated a certain way. They care about others in need for their own sake. And those thoughts and feelings or motivations give rise to helping behavior. In particular, helping behavior in situations where it's thought to be relevant. So where there's a perception of need, where there's suffering that's going on that could be helped, could be addressed. So that's not just at the hospital. It's not just by donating to charity. It's in a variety of different situations relevant to helping. The compassionate person will be led to help. Mm-hmm. Okay, and that's the positive side. And we can do the same thing on the negative side. We can do similar illustrations, say, with cruelty or dishonesty, or lack of generosity. The vices have a very much a similar structure to the virtues. They're just oriented in the opposite direction. They're going to be leading to bad actions, which have typically bad results, but they're still going to concern thinking, feeling, giving rise to subsequent action.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, the thinking, the motivations, giving rise to certain actions. And I like how you mentioned it's this disposition toward it. You can go against the disposition, but your character has to do with what you're disposed to do, or how you're disposed to think, how you're disposed to be motivated, and so forth.
That's right. That's how I think about it. That is how most people think about it. I think about it in the character literature. So when you're asleep, your character is not active. When you're eating breakfast or something like that, if you're an honest person, you're still disposed to be honest, but it may not be triggered or activated because it's not a relevant situation. But when you're taking the test as a student, that's a situation where your honesty can come into play. That disposition could be activated, and you could think it's wrong to cheat. You can be motivated not to cheat, and you refrain from cheating even when you have an opportunity to cheat. So these dispositions kind of go on and off throughout the day. They don't have to be activated all the time. And as you said, they can be outweighed. So one virtue can be outweighed by another virtue. They can actually compete with each other. Or a virtue sometimes maybe could be outweighed by self-interested desires or some other kind of temptation or something else going on in the psychology. So there's no guarantee that just because you have this disposition, it's always going to come into to play, even when it's supposed to come into play.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we might go ahead and say something about this now. So somebody might think, well, I have a pretty good character then. Based on what you said, I've got a pretty good character. I'm disposed to be honest, be kind, be compassionate, and so forth. No, I'm not perfect at it, but based on how you define character, that's my disposition. On the flip side, we might think of other people and say, well, that person's got a bad character. They, so now that's fairly like black and white, good, bad character. Is that a helpful way to think about it? Or should we, think of it maybe more along a spectrum? What do you think?
So there's questions about how do we categorize character? And then there's questions about where do we fall in the categorization? So what kind of category should we use? And then where are we in those categories? So I think it is helpful what you said to think about virtue on the one hand, coming in degrees. So I don't think anyone, with one exception, famous exception, has ever been perfectly virtuous. But relevant to the show here, Jesus was perfectly virtuous. Otherwise, everyone else falls short of that. But some people might be virtuous to some degree, even if not perfectly virtuous. Similarly, on the vice side, vice comes in degrees, and we can ask if anyone's been perfectly vicious. But then there's also, I think, room in the middle between virtue and vice to think about a kind of mixed character, a character that has some good sides to it and some bad sides to it, but not good enough to count as virtuous, not bad enough to count as vicious. The idea of virtue and vice, and then a kind of middle space is an idea that's been around for a long time. Aristotle had that idea too. So I think that's a perfectly fine, broad template to follow. Now, the second question becomes, well, where are we? Or where are you? Where am I? And you're quite right to think that many people have a high opinion of their own character. So you can look at the empirical data on this. People do self-report assessments of their character. They tend to rate themselves a 4 out of 5, where 5 is the highest and 1 is the lowest. And that's on character in general, and that's on particular character traits too, like honesty or compassion. So we tend to think of ourselves as doing pretty darn good, but we'll probably talk in a few minutes about what the data actually suggests.
Right. Yeah, we're getting to that, what these psychological studies show. Yeah. Well, before discussing that, I found this chapter really intriguing, actually. And you spent a chapter saying, well, trying to answer this question, why should we even bother developing a good character? Now that we understand, what character is, why care about being having a good character or a virtuous character and so forth? So, I know you make several points. If you want, you can say as much or as little as you'd like.
Sure. So I think it is an important question. Just because we now understand what virtue is, it doesn't automatically follow that we will care about it or should care about it. After all, we live busy lives. There's a lot going on. There's a lot that's competing for our attention. I can only devote so much time to different projects and plans. But I think this is one that we should devote a significant amount of time to. And in chapter 2 of the book, I kind of outline a variety of reasons. Maybe I'll just mention the reason in one sentence for a couple of them, and then expand on one of them in more detail. One reason is that virtues are intrinsically good. They're just valuable in and of themselves. Another reason is that they make society better off. So if you live in a society of justice and compassion, that society is going to be a better society than a vicious society. So that's a reason to work towards the promotion of virtue in general. Sorry, I couldn't give one sentence for that one. I tried. Another reason is within the context of religions. Most religions care about virtue and make a case for why we should care about it, whether that's karma, matter of karma, whether that's a matter of rewards in the afterlife, whether that's a matter of trying to embody the character that the designer wanted us to have in the first place. A variety of religious stories going on here. One I'll focus on just a little bit more. It has to do with self-benefits. And this is a somewhat odd one to focus on the most, maybe, because you might think that's kind of antithetical to virtue. But there's good reason to think that if you pursue virtue, you can also benefit yourself in the process. That it's good for you. Now, there's no guarantee. This is just a statistical claim, a probabilistic claim. But in general, there's a intuitive connection that your life will go better. And there's also empirical data to back it up. So things like generosity have been correlated with good things, good outcomes in life, like longer lifespan, increased subjective well-being, greater academic achievements, higher positive mood. So a variety of good, we'll call them good things, seem to be linked to good character. Last thought, though, if that's the only reason why you pursue virtue, then that's only going to take you so far. Because if you only care about becoming a good person so as to get the benefits for yourself, you actually won't be able to attain true virtue. True virtue needs to be selfless, not self-centered. So the hope is that for some people, this might be the way to draw them in. But if it just stays there, they won't get too far. And so the hope is that after a while, people will come to see there's something more to this than just benefiting myself. There's some real value to this, independent of whether I benefit or not.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. Okay. Excellent. You did a great job summarizing that. Okay. So now this next question really hits on several chapters of the book. So you spend several chapters talking about psychological studies that reveal quite a bit about our characters. So we go back to that question we said a few minutes ago, where am I on this in terms of these categories and the spectrum? Where do I fit? Mm-hmm. And these psychological studies can actually reveal a lot. Maybe you've got some blind spots that these psychological studies can help bring out. So let's break these character traits down one at a time, and we'll start by talking about helping. So what do these studies reveal about our disposition to help others?
Sure. So let me just make a preliminary comment first. I think you're right to say at the very beginning that we could look to a variety of sources of evidence and data on this question of how good are we. And I'm fine with looking to the Bible, for example, or other theological resources. I think actually what's going to happen is that the picture that emerges from psychological research is going to harmonize with that picture we would have gotten from looking at a biblical source. The reason why I like to go to psychology is I think it's helpful to look not at any one study, but look at a cumulative picture that emerges from a whole batch of different studies. And so you can put, no one study is going to put people in lots of different situations. But if you look at 100 studies, each of which puts people in a different situation, relevant to helping, for instance, you can start seeing a picture or pattern emerging about, do people help? If they do help, under what conditions? If they don't help, under what conditions? And so are they good conditions? Are they bad conditions? Are they conditions that a virtuous person would respond to? Are they conditions that a vicious person would respond to? And all that. To give you one now, answer the question instead of talking around it, to give you one study that I talk about here in connection to helping, this is a famous, the one that comes to mind off the bat is a famous illustration of the group effect or the bystander effect. So one of the earliest studies was done in 1968. It's called the Lady in Distress study. A participant comes into the lab, is told to fill out a survey, is taken into a room, given a survey and a pencil, and is working away at the survey. A few minutes later, the person in charge comes into the room again with another person who looks like they're being told to do the same thing. You don't know this person. This person sits down at the same table and is filling out the same survey with you. The person in charge leaves. A few minutes later, there's a loud crash in the next room, followed by screaming. The person in charge's voice you can recognize as saying things like, ouch, ouch, ouch. This ladder, it fell on me. I can't get it off. My leg, ouch. They're kind of screaming in pain. And nothing's happening. I mean, they're still screaming. No one's coming to their help. What would you do? Well, you would naturally say, I would help, right? People, you ask the people, of course I would help. I would jump up and help. Well, it really depends upon whether that stranger in the room with you will help or not. So in this 1968 version, only 7% helped when the stranger did nothing to help. 7%. It means 93% did not come to the aid of the person in clear need in an emergency situation. And it's generalizes. So this has been replicated many times using different versions of the study, different emergencies, and it happens over and over again when we see this kind of effect. What's the upshot of this? I say, that's not what I would expect of a compassionate person. I would expect a compassionate person to help, even if a stranger doesn't. Now, I'll stop here. Don't conclude anything about compassion just from one study. Again, it's my looking at hundreds and hundreds of studies and looking at the complete picture. All I'm doing here is just giving one illustration, not jumping to any big conclusion from it.
Right. Yeah, you definitely. So there's more. Maybe this would help actually. This book came out of this larger project that you did called the Character Project. And my understanding of that project, and you can elaborate a bit to help people get the idea of all the studies you're considering. You actually had a team of people doing different studies in different conditions, and you're trying to pull together all the findings to form this picture of what our characters look like.
That's correct. So for the Character Project, that was a 5-year project. And one of the main things we did is we funded researchers all over the world to do new innovative empirical studies on character. And so that was done well in advance of this book. I got to see the published results, and I drew on some of those published results in the book, as well as plenty of other published results going back to the 1950s and 1960s. So a whole kind of everything I could read, I was drawing on. And I first wrote 2 academic books summarizing this research. And they're published in 2013, 2014. And then the Character Gap was my attempt to distill a lot of that, kind of cut down the number of studies, cut down on the statistics and some of the gory details, and kind of make it more accessible and interesting for a broader audience.
Right. Yeah. So it's not like you're just basing this off of a few studies. It's a very cumulative case here.
They should be very skeptical. Very skeptical of big conclusions drawn from a couple studies.
Yeah. Okay. So that was helping. And when I read that, I was like, wow, who would have thought? Because I would have said, like, I would help the person. But and this is a theme you repeat throughout the book. If you're like most people, you know, we have a large sample of people here. If you're like most people, then you won't help unless the stranger helps.
Mhm.
In that case,
Right.
and that's pretty surprising. It's to me anyway.
Yep, that's right. Yep. So, I mean, I'm similarly. When I first started doing this research, I was similarly surprised. So that's probably what drew me in and kept me working on it. So some of these revelations about other people's character. But oh wait, I'm probably no exception. Probably revelatory about my character too. So,
yeah. Okay, so then you discuss in another chapter a different type of character trait when it comes to harm. So how are people in general disposed to harm? At least people in, maybe you want to say too, the studies seem to focus on maybe the Western world. Is that fair to say?
Right. Yep. So a couple of things here. One, I want to be upfront about the limitations of the studies I'm drawing from. Almost entirely Western populations. Too many studies using students. These are just kind of common complaints about psychological research on moral behavior. And also studies done in the last 50 years. So we should be very skeptical about drawing grandiose conclusions about humans throughout history, or humans across the world, or humans in all age ranges from these kind of studies. So I think we have to be nuanced and careful about our conclusions. So as far as harming is concerned, I'll here give another classic study, which is the Milgram study. So probably many listeners are already familiar with this, so I'll just run through it briefly. Also from the 1960s, these are the shock studies. Milgram did a variety of different ones, but there's one in particular that he's most famous, most well known for, where a participant comes into the lab, is told to give a test to another person in the next room. For every wrong answer that person in the next room gets, the participant is supposed to turn up a dial, a shock dial. Starts at a very low level of shock, next wrong answer, higher level, next wrong answer, higher level, higher level, higher level, higher level. Also in the room with the participants is an authority figure standing behind the participants, who, if there's some objection made by the participants, will say things like, please continue, or you must continue. Well, it turns out that this is rigged. The person in the next room is not actually getting shocks, but the participant doesn't know that. And so it's also rigged so that the test taker is going to get a lot of wrong answers. And as the shock dial goes up, the response from the next room gets worse. Screaming, pounding on the walls, complaining, I have a heart condition, saying, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. Get me out of here. And on the dial, the last thing that's marked on the dial is XXX, which is implying a lethal level of shock. And more than 60% of participants went all the way up to the XXX level.
More than 60%.
More than 60%. At which point there was silence in the next room. After all that screaming and pounding and so forth, eventually there was silence.
Wow.
So the idea is that, or you can draw a whole bunch of different lessons from it, but one lesson from it is that ordinary people, and I don't think there's any reason to think that these were bad apples or, especially vicious people, or anything like this, just ordinary people in a certain kind of situation can be brought willingly to kill an innocent person. Again, not a good reflection on our character. So I will say at this point, this is starting to sound quite bleak and negative. My overall view is not that we are vicious people, and we could expand on later, but I'm noticing now that we're kind of focusing on some negative results.
Right.
But there's more to, there's a little bit of a positive side to this too. So
yeah, that's something that I guess I was kind of holding back intentionally, getting people to kind of think, oh yeah, I see where this is going, but then we switch it on. That's the other shock element.
Stole your thunder.
Yeah, but you're right. Yeah, we've kind of looked at some negatives, but one thing I really liked about your book was it actually helped me see the balance. it's easy to kind of fall on the extremes, but you help help, I guess, give some reasons to think that there's this mixture. So yeah, we'll say more about that. Let's do one more study. You have a chapter on lying, but for the sake of time and interest, we'll just skip that for now. Let's talk about cheating. So we talked about helping, harming, now cheating. What do we see from these studies about cheating?
Yeah. So this research especially interests me because after I wrote this book, I got really interested in honesty and dishonesty, and started a whole project on it, and then have subsequently written a book on honesty. So this is like where I'm really at right now. As far as cheating is concerned, I'll give you a study because that's what we're doing, and then we can draw some larger implications. The study here I'll mention is a really interesting setup that's been used in the last 20 years, and so it's much more recent research to assess people's cheating and what factors influence cheating. So a participant will come into the lab again. They'll be given a test with 20 problems. They're told you'll be paid 50 cents per correct answer. So they'll take the test, and in the control condition, which is the first setup we're going to have, they'll take the test, work as hard as they can, turn it in, and the experimenter will grade it for them. So it's just like objective grading. You either got it right or you got it wrong. You're paid accordingly. See you later. Another group of participants, though, will be in what we'll call the shredder condition. And they'll come in one at a time. They'll take the test. They'll told you 50 cents per correct answer. They will grade the test themselves, destroy all the materials, any evidence, and get to say whatever they want as far as their performance is concerned. Of course, they could say what they actually got. I guess they could say worse than they actually got. But of course, the temptation here is going to say, I did better. Not to say it that way, but say, privately, I got 7 right. Publicly, I got 14 right. And get paid more.
Mm-hmm.
So what ended up happening? Well, I actually kind of gave it away. So in the control, in one version of the study, the controls got 7 out of 20 right. The shredder condition participants got 14 out of 20 right. In quotation marks. Correct, right? So did they really get 14? No. I guess it's possible they did, but I think it's very unlikely. Much more likely that they saw an opportunity to cheat. They gave into temptation to cheat to make more money, and they took advantage of it. Now, that again doesn't reflect too well on our character. I think that's not what you expect of an honest person. But there's more to this story, a better side to it, which we can either pursue now or save till later.
Yeah, I think now that we've laid out these studies, let's start talking about what we can draw from it, and go for the positive side as well.
We need some positive, probably. It gets too depressing just to focus on these kind of bleak results. So back to the shredder. A third version of the setup. Participant comes in, told to take the test, 50 cents per correct answer. But before you take the test, we want you to sign your university's honor code. So Wake Forest has honor code. Many schools have an honor code. You're pledging that you're not going to lie, cheat, or steal. So that's what the participants had to do for their school. Then they took the test, shredder condition. They got to grade it themselves, report whatever they wanted. First, some expectations before I tell the results. If people were really dishonest, I would expect their performance to not change very much. What they said, would not change very much from the original shredder condition. I would expect an honest person to go through the motions of signing the honor code and then taking advantage of the opportunity to cheat. But lo and behold, what happened? The performance was back down to the control level. There was no evidence of cheating. And this has been replicated a couple of times, although I like to see more replications. The additional replications are positive, that it's looking like this might hold up as a result. So that is what I would expect of an honest person, not what I would expect of a dishonest person. Of course, the original shredder condition was what I would expect of a dishonest person, not of an honest person. So now we've got these kind of two sides of the story. Some encouraging results and some kind of depressing results. And this was not affected by the payoff amount. So in the honor code version, even if you upped the stakes to $2 per correct answer, there was still no cheating detected. That's a good sign. So that's one for that. Let me go back to one of our earlier conversations. So let's go back to helping. So there we had the kind of depressing news about group effects and not helping when others are not helping. A different body of research has found that empathy is a great way to get people to help. So if you can kind of induce an empathetic state of mind in people with respect to the suffering of another person, it's much more likely that they will help. What does that mean, empathetic state of mind? It means you're trying to think about the world from their perspective. So this person who's in need, trying to not imagine what you would do, but kind of step into their perspective and see the world and the suffering that they're facing. And what that will often do is motivate us to help address that suffering. And here's the really interesting news. Not only is that a great way to increase helping behavior, but it also seems to do so for selfless reasons. So there's a link between empathy and altruistic motivation. Motivation to help others for their own sake, selflessly, rather than to benefit myself. That's not at all what I would expect of a cruel person or a callous person. So I don't go with vice explanations there either. But I also have to take into account things like the bystander effect. So I can't just say we're all compassionate. So where I land in all this research is that most of us are in a murky middle with some good sides to our character and some bad sides to our character, different situations that's going to shine forth. But we tend to not be good enough to count as virtuous, nor bad enough to count as vicious.
Yes. Yeah, that came through very strongly in the book. And that's what I liked very much, because I think in certain circles, I guess, within Christianity, because this is a channel that focuses on interviewing Christian scholars, there's definitely circles in Christianity that are very strongly, if you'd walk away with the conclusion that we're just terrible. There's just nothing good about us at all. But I appreciate how from these studies we can see, hey, there are certainly negative qualities that we, if we're like most people, we have. But there's these positive qualities as well. So we, on the spectrum, we have a mixture of qualities, some virtues, some vices.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful and insightful.
Well, so just a quick comment on the theology side of this. If this empirical story I'm telling were to be in tension with, say, a biblical story about how good we are or bad we are, then I think there'd be a problem. And so if the biblical story is one according to which most of us are wretched, then something's got to give. Either the biblical story's got to give or my interpretation of the data's got to give. However, I don't think the biblical story is fine-grained enough to specify exactly how good or bad our character is. I think there's a latitude in the reading of the text such that you could think that we're pretty bad, but you don't have to think that. And so I think to develop that just one step further, I think the story that I've got to tell here fits very nicely if you take into account two doctrines. One, the doctrine of original sin, but also the doctrine that we're creating the image of God. And that image of God is not wiped away by original sin. But on the flip side, original sin is a corruption that affects all human beings. So it has to have some teeth to it. But I don't think it's enough teeth such that we are all in the vicious category. So I think it all actually fits together nicely.
Yeah. That reminds me, there's a book by Michael Rhoda called Taking Pascal's Wager. And in that book, he has a chapter on the ring of truth with respect to like Christian doctrines. And it seems like some doctrines have this, they resonate with us. They just seem, oh yeah, that seems true. And he bases it off of something Pascal says about we're simultaneously like these masterpieces, but also very wretched, or something. You probably know the actual words he uses, but it's something like that. And that was Pascal's thinking, was Christianity resonates with our experience. There are this very positive side to us, and there's this negative side as well. So
I think that resonates well with my experience. It also resonates with the psychological research. I do want to offer one little caveat to this, though, which is that I think we want to keep in mind their individual differences. So that's the psychology lingo for saying that our characters aren't all the same here. So I do think the most plausible story is one that something like a bell curve, where most of us are in this middle space, at least more carefully. As far as the data is concerned, there's good reason to think that most Westerners from Europe and America in the last 50 years, so suitably qualified, are in this middle space, but that there are outliers too. And that rings with our experience. I think that also very much rings with what you see in the Old Testament and New Testament. On the one hand, there are exemplars, there are paradigms of virtue who are doing better, are much further along than we are. And on the other hand, there are, of course, some quite vicious people and some awful, wretched people throughout history. So I don't want to paint everyone with the same brush here.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now that we have this kind of picture that emerged about our characters, let's think about, I found this part of the book really, as a matter of fact, this is why I picked up the book. I want to become a more virtuous person, and I want strategies that can help me improve my character. So the last 2 chapters of the book, you talk about secular strategies that we can use to improve our characters. And then the very last chapter is going to be about religious practices. So let's start by thinking about secular strategies here. What are, to you, some of maybe 1 or 2 of the most promising secular strategies we can do to improve our characters?
Great. So one initial point here is that this whole discussion assumes that we can improve our characters. That shouldn't be automatically assumed. Maybe that we have the character we have right now is fixed and kind of we're stuck with it. Maybe it's genetically inherited. You can't just assume that character is malleable. But fortunately, there's good evidence to think it is. We could dive into that if we wanted to. But character can be reshaped. It can be changed through our own initiatives, also through the impact of our environment, our situations, and institutions too. I go through a variety of different strategies. Some I set aside as not very promising, so I'm not going to address those here. I focus on 3 that I think are more promising. So I'll maybe you can cut me off if I go too long, but at least I'll highlight a couple. One is actually piggybacking on what I was just talking about with exemplars. So looking to role models of virtue who have gotten farther along the road than we have, and admiring them for their virtue in such a way that gives rise to a desire in us to be more like them, to emulate them. We're inspired by them to become more like them. Those can be historical exemplars like, honesty, Lincoln, courage, Harriet Tubman, wisdom, Socrates, compassion, Jesus. They could be, and maybe sometimes are more effective if they are contemporary exemplars, friends, family members, community leaders, co-workers, people who are in our day-to-day lives on a regular basis and who are relatable and we can connect to. So I can say more about any of these, but in the interest of time, just going to give you an overview. The second one has to do with moral reminders. This goes back to the honor code study with cheating. So oftentimes we do know what the right thing to do is. It's not like we're a blank slate. We don't know anything about morality. We often know that cheating is wrong, lying is wrong, hurting people is wrong. but that self-interest can compete with those things and get in the way of doing the right thing. So the idea of moral reminders is to make the moral values we already have, which are usually pretty good, more salient to our consciousness, more fresh in our minds, more psychologically immediate, so that they can do their work, can lead us to do the right thing. And that's what happened, I think, in the shredder condition with the honor code. The honor code serves as a moral reminder, or for the students, brings fresh to their attention why it's wrong to cheat, or that it's wrong to cheat, and why I don't want to be a cheater. And that was psychologically effective in keeping them from cheating.
Mm-hmm.
So we could have other things like that in our lives. We could have a morning reading to start us off. We could have a diary at the end of the day. We could have text messages and emails throughout our days. We could have things on the wall. We could have all kinds of different things to serve as reminders. And then the last one I'll mention briefly is greater self-awareness. So the idea here is, this is what I call it getting the word out. But it boils down to understanding ourselves better using any resource we can get, in particular, the psychological research. So you were surprised when you learned about the group effect. That was surprising to you. Well, now that you know about it, you're more educated about it as a tendency in other people and in yourself. So you can work against that if you ever get in situations where it might come into play. So that was a tendency that you had that was probably more under your conscious radar screen, flying under there, less salient to your conscious attention. But now it is more salient to your conscious attention. And in particular, in a study like that, what has been revealed is how much we are concerned with embarrassing ourselves in front of others. So one explanation of what's going on, why don't we help in emergency situations when others are not helping, is that we fear embarrassment. That's the kind of dominant explanation, or at least partial explanation of these results. We don't want to look like a fool in front of a stranger if it turns out that there's really not an emergency. Mm-hmm. So now I'm more aware of that. I'm more aware of the fact that I'm actually motivated by fear of embarrassment to not do the right thing. I maybe didn't know about that. Similarly, like obedience to authorities. How powerful obedience to authorities can be. I didn't know about that. Now I do. And so I need to work against that, especially in situations where it might kick in and lead me to do the wrong thing. So that's what I call getting the word out about ourselves to foster greater self-awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. So those three strategies were having exemplars that you're trying to, that you're basically using as like inspiration, as a model. There was a section of the book that I just thought was really inspiring as I listened to those. I think you told the stories of 3 different individuals. Mm-hmm. And yeah, each story was very inspiring. I remember going to work that day just being like, man, I want to try and emulate that person as much as I can today. So that was really good. That second strategy was moral reminders. And that you gave the example of that honor code as serving as a moral reminder. And then that third strategy was getting the word out, right? And so that you become more self-reflective. So practicing that kind of self-reflection.
That's right. Yep. Good summary. You nailed it.
Now, you mentioned in the book there are drawbacks to these. Do you want to say anything about maybe a drawback?
Well, I mean, there are a couple of things to say here. I think we should always be kind of even-handed and tell a kind of fair story. So first of all, none of these are kind of magic pills. Like you start doing them, suddenly you're going to become a virtuous person. It doesn't work that way. The path to virtue is a long road full of many setbacks. You might make some progress for a couple months and then might backslide, and go back in the other direction. So none of this is like a 10-step plan. There's no recipe. There's no guaranteed results. And the other thing I'll notice, as just by way of kind of telling both sides, there's not a ton of research to back these strategies up, which is sad to me. I mean, after all, I've been saying how important research is and looking at studies, and here I have to be honest, there's not a ton of empirical research to support them. Why is that? Well, maybe not so surprising. To really study these strategies well, you would want to have a control group and an experimental group. You would want to assess people's baseline character in each group. And then in the experimental group, you would want to implement the strategy. In the control group, you don't implement the strategy. And then you implement the strategy over time, not just a day or a week or even a month, but regularly over weeks and weeks and weeks. And then you do periodic assessments again of where people's character is. And then at the end of the period, whatever it's 6 months, a year, or 2 years, you see where people are. Mm-hmm. That's a very hard study to do. It's expensive. It takes a long time. There are all kinds of confounding variables that are going to get involved. You need a lot of participants to do it effectively. So not a huge amount of research yet to back it up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's shift then to this final chapter in the book, which will be relevant for, especially for this channel, given that we want to try and think about the role of that Christianity can play in this process. So, how can religious practices help improve our characters?
Yeah, this is a big one, and I'll say a few initial things, and I'm happy to go in whatever direction you want to go in. So first of all, I want to be real clear here that I nowhere make the argument that you have to be religious in order to be virtuous. We know plenty of examples of people who are religious who are not virtuous. And I think there are plenty of examples of people who are not religious who are virtuous. So I'm nowhere making that argument. I'm also in this chapter primarily focusing on Christianity, but I'm not in the process intending to say that other religions are second rate or don't do as good a job or can't have positive contributions to make to character development. I was just strategic. Rather than spending 5 pages on Buddhism, 5 pages on Islam, 5 pages on Judaism, I said, look, I'm going to do a deeper dive into one religion, the one I know the best, and see what it has to say, but noting that many of the points do generalize to other religions. So I want to be real clear. Having said that, I look at 3 things here. Religious, I'll frame it in the context of Christianity, having noted those qualifications. Christian practices in a social environment with the internal workings of the Holy Spirit. The three things I focus on. So in Christianity, there are a number of different practices that believers partake in that can improve and build upon their character. So one example is prayer. Regular prayer may not have as its goal or the focus of it being to improve our character. That may not be what you're praying for. You can, of course, but you may be praying for your loved ones. You may be praying for a sickness. You may be praying for our country. But a byproduct or side effect of that can often be character growth, I think. What character traits? Well, one example would be humility. You're willing to put yourself under a higher being and ask for the guidance and help of that higher being. It's a humble stance. Another illustration of this has to do with tithing, or just donating or to the church in general. The purpose of that may not be to become a more generous person. In fact, that'd be kind of weird if that's why you're doing it. Every Sunday you're going to church, say, I'm going to give that money to make myself a more generous person. No, you're doing it for the betterment of the church, but in the process can foster generosity. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. It doesn't happen though in isolation, typically in the Christian church. It's not that you're working on your own character, trying to improve and engage in these practices by yourself. Mm-hmm. It's in community with other believers who are on a similar path, hope to be at least on a similar path of becoming fully virtuous people. So that can have all kinds of roles. It can help to keep one accountable. It can provide exemplars, like we were just talking about, or role models. It can also lead to a discipline if need be. So it's others gathering around one, helping one strengthening one in the process of character improvement. And then the last thing is, it need not be just human-centered, as if human beings are left to their own devices, either individually or in community, to improve themselves. And this is a difference here, a distinctive feature of Christianity. The first two elements, you can find analogs in other religions, but in Christianity, there's this idea that the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Spirit, works internally in believers during the process of sanctification. So God is in some way serving to shape and mold the character of those who are undergoing the process of sanctification. How exactly that works? Well, there's interesting philosophical issues there, and that could be another meeting, another time, but it's supposed to be happening.
Mm-hmm.
So God's coming alongside of us and aiding us in some way, cooperatively and collectively, in trying to make us into the people God wanted us to be all along.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I end the book.
Yeah. So through prayer, charitable giving, community, and then also through the work of the Holy Spirit, that kind of divine cooperation. These are all things that can help improve our characters, specifically related to religious practices.
That's correct. That's how I think about it. Now, do they help? That's an interesting question. Is there empirical research to show they help? That's an interesting question too. But I think Christianity has told a pretty consistent message, has a pretty consistent message over the years that they should help.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so now I want to shift. We're coming up on an hour, so we're doing well on time. I think there'll be time for at least a couple questions here before we wrap up. So let me take down the current question on the screen. One of these questions was actually sent in by a patron before the interview. He couldn't watch live, so I'll just read it to you, and I can't put it up on the screen. So he said, hello, Professor Miller. I'm interested in your response to a critique made by Rebecca Stengel in her review of the character gap in the journal Faith and Philosophy. So here's a quote from her review, and you'll offer your response. Consider in particular Dr. Miller's suggestion that we might select our situations in order to improve our character. Here, he approvingly cites John Doris's famous example of being invited to a secluded dinner party with a flirtatious colleague while one's spouse is away. The partnered person who avoids candlelit dinners with colleagues is surely wise, but is not thereby made a more virtuous person, at least not if virtue is a disposition of the heart, as Miller thinks that it is. Perhaps Miller hopes that simply avoiding adultery eventually makes it less attractive, but it isn't as if avoiding forbidden fruit always makes the fruit less attractive. Quite the contrary. So I think we need to hear more about this strategy if we think it's going to work.
Wow, someone did their homework. Someone had tracked down a review of the book in a journal by my very good friend Rebecca Stengel. So let me give a little context just to make sure that for people who are not familiar with the book that they understand where that's coming from. As I said, there were a number of secular strategies that I discussed, and I didn't go through them all during our time here. One I did not mention is called selecting your situations. What the idea is that it's wise to try to keep yourself out of dangerous situations ahead of time, morally fraught situations, like the example that was just read, going to dinner with a flirtatious colleague by yourself when your spouse is out of town. You might think, oh, my character is so robust. I'm so committed and loyal that it doesn't matter. Well, one implication of a lot of these studies is that when you get into the actual situation, the situation can be quite powerful and, sway you away from your moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is to not get yourself in the situation in the first place, rather than trust in the strength of your own character in the situation. I tend to think that the criticism is a good one. I think this strategy has some value, but actually, since I wrote the book, I think it kind of less and less value than I probably initially thought. Um, it's quite right to say, look, just avoiding tempting situations is not going to thereby make you a good person. Right? It might make you act badly less,
Mm-hmm.
but the heart also matters too. A couple other things as well. First of all, it's hard to avoid all tempting situations in life. Sometimes you can't avoid them. I mean, you just can't. You're just going to be thrown into them. Also, you have to already have a certain kind of degree of virtue to be able to discern whether a situation is going to be tempting or not. So the strategy actually relies upon you being virtuous to some extent to begin with. So I'm just going to concede that I think it's a good strategy, but very much has to be supplemented with other ones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, good. We've got one comment, and then if there's time, I'll throw in a question that I had based on a previous interview I did. So this individual, Rez Gade, said, I think one drawback to having higher self-awareness is we are also disposed to greater despair. How high we can go is also how low we can go. Thus, the quote is, ignorance is bliss. So what do you think about that kind of drawback?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. That that is a danger. You might not like what you find, and when you introspect and you draw on the psychological evidence to learn more about your own mind and your own psychology, you may not like what you find there. I guess I'll say a couple of things. I want to keep in mind first that my picture is mixed character, so I don't think that we're going to find just outright vice. When we gain greater self-awareness, we're going to find some good things too, like the empathy results, which are also surprising to many people. How powerful empathy is as an altruistic motivator. That could be quite encouraging, and it could kind of inspire me to be more empathetic once I learn that about myself, that I have that capacity within me. I guess the other thing I'll say is I would rather know about some of these negative tendencies ahead of time rather than finding out about them when I get into morally serious situations. So I would rather know about my tendency to not help strangers when I'm in a crowd and try to work against that rather than discover that if I'm actually in that situation and someone's life could be at stake. I would rather know it ahead of time as opposed to after the fact.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Well, last question here. I don't see any more in the live chat, so this one's going to come from me, and it's based on a previous interview that I did. So a couple months ago now, I guess, I interviewed Adam Pelser on this particular paper that was published in Faith and Philosophy, where he argues that Christ was able to grow in virtue. Christ remained sinless. He never sinned, but he very much experienced temptations as we experience them. And the only way that is possible to experience the real pull of those temptations, at least this was his argument, was if Christ had some desires to sin, but nevertheless he did not act on those desires, but he did experience those desires like we do. And the way that he was able to grow in virtue then was by his character was shaped such that those desires over time went away, and he had these perfectly pure desires to do the right thing then, and only those desires, I guess. But I've mentioned that just because earlier in the interview you say there's only been one perfectly virtuous person, and it's Jesus. So what do you think about that paper by Pelser?
A couple of things. First, he was my postdoc, so he worked with me for a year, and we through one of our initiatives we actually funded his research on that topic. I look, he knows this stuff better than I do, so I'm very reticent to go against what he says. I I think his solution is going to be very controversial, and not many people tend to follow him, but he makes a really strong case for it. So the key, I think, move here is that if he's going to be like us, if Jesus is going to be like us in every way, but without sin, well, one way he would have to be like us is to be tempted. Otherwise, he's not really like us. And so it's hard to hold that element while also saying that he was perfectly virtuous throughout his entire life. So I would say I'm probably more tempted. Well, maybe that's not the right word. I'm more sympathetic to Professor Pelzer's solution than most people are, because I don't see any other way to square the circle otherwise. So a cautious support for Professor Pelzer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we just hit the hour mark, and I want to respect your time, so I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much for coming on. I really enjoyed this conversation.
I did too. Thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be on your show.
All right, go and check out that interview that I mentioned with Dr. Pelser. Right now, it's the only other one I have that's focused on virtue and vice, but there will be more to come. That's my plan. I want to get more interviews on around this topic. So thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.